Yeah, so this is actually like I followed your content from way back when you first started. And for me, like I'm sort of like the steroid hormone guy on the internet. And the only thing I noticed that I was like critical of, and I had made I think a video a few years ago about it, is you would constantly show your blood work and I would consistently see this like female level SHBG. And I was like, I would see you try and like rationalize it at the time. And then I would see other carnivore guys who followed, were inspired by what you were doing, try and justify their like nuked free testosterone levels and be like, oh, it's just like, I have higher sensitivity to it. It's just like the androgen receptors don't need that much. And I'm just like, there's got to be like something fucking off here. And then eventually you started incorporating honey and fruits. And now everything's kind of like normalized and, optimized, presumably. So like for you, like I don't know if your book also had like the principles of no carbs in it, but was that like a really hard thing to walk back from because you were pretty gung-ho on it for a while? And like I commend you for being not like the zealots who are like, nope, fuck it, keto only, like this is what you got to do. Like you walked that back and said you were wrong and this is what you think now. And I thought that was great. So I was just wondering like what that process was like.
I took some heat, man. I took some heat. And, probably rightly so. I mean, but this is what it's about for me. Like, this is the way it should be. Like, we're learning. I'm not going to get everything right. I've always said that. Like, who says I'm going to get everything right? Maybe I got something right. Maybe I didn't get anything right. But it's just interesting to think about it and ask the questions. And the problem with the Carnivore Code, so my book, the first book I wrote was called The Carnivore Code, is books are not a living document. They're such an anachronism, I think. Like you create this book and then it's out there in print and people are like, oh, I read your book. And I'm like, that's great. Chapter 6, 7, and 8 have revisions in my mind that you may not know about because I definitely evolved, changed my mind a lot about fructose, which is a fascinating rabbit hole to go down. And I think something that is still very relevant today because there's a lot of people who conflate studies looking at fructose in isolation and fructose in whole foods, which is crazy to think about and really interesting sort of nutritional reductionism and the dangers of that. But yeah, I changed my view on zero carb. I changed my view on carbohydrates in general. And the labs show it. Like I think my last SHBG was close to 50. The total went up, the free went up. And yeah, I was trying to understand this in the process because you're sort of like an astronaut. You're like a pirate, man. You're sailing on seas that not many people have been down. Nobody's done keto that much. And you're like, oh shit. I mean, I'm doing this ketogenic diet, which, people say is good. And there's Dom D'Agostino being like, oh yeah, histone deacetylase inhibitors and ketones are great. And you're like, well, these super smart guys are saying this is good. And then I'm talking to David Sinclair and he's talking about the sirtuins. And I'm like, look, like ketones activate sirtuins. Like there's a longevity effect of ketones, right? And then you're like, but my SHBG is 120. Like what the, what the fuck? Like, why is this happening? I'm like, well, I can still get an erection, thank God. But like, well, I don't know. Maybe it's, and then, just again, I'm not going to throw Sean under the bus, but you look at Sean's labs and he's only shown them once and his total was like in the 200s for his testosterone. So it's very low. And he was like, oh, androgen receptor density. And I'm like, well, he's a pretty big, strong looking guy who looks pretty good for mid 50s to tell you the truth. So I don't know of a way to really quantify androgen receptor density, but I'll tell you that I feel better overall with carbohydrates in my diet. So that was interesting. And what I learned was this is, you learn this the hard way, but it's really good. Like you go to the nutritional literature, you can find stuff to support both sides on almost everything. You can find stuff to support keto, you can find stuff to support carbohydrates. And so it's nuanced and it's kind of fun to think like, how do we navigate this? Like, is it good for people to eat carbohydrates? Is it bad for people to eat carbohydrates? I had massively improved sleep, body. I would say the composition improved. I felt like my muscles were fuller, less muscle cramping, less heart palpitations when I incorporated carbohydrates back. But yeah, that was difficult. So the detractors then are like, this guy wrote this book about zero carb. And if you read the book carefully, it's not totally dogmatic about zero carb. And now he's adding honey and fruit. I think somebody was like, I hope you guys got your money back. And I was like, well, like, I still think it's a valuable book.
I think in general, now, like, this is something I deal with too, is because I've been publishing content for, I don't know, 5 years at this point, approximately, maybe more. And stuff I said in the first couple of years, like I genuinely don't have time to go like re-edit articles I've wrote over half a decade ago. So it's like I just would compel people to follow whatever the most recent content is of your content creator you're trying to educate yourself from, because oftentimes they will learn something that totally goes in the face of something they said like 3 years ago or something. And it's kind of, I think that's admirable that people are like going out of their way to further educate themselves, even if they're seen as like an expert authority in a space. Because you could easily just claim like, I already know everything, this is the way you're supposed to do it, and then just like dig your heels in the ground and say like nothing I'm doing is wrong, even if your blood work shows otherwise, or you in your head you think you could optimize some other way, but it doesn't align with what you've said in the past. So in general, like some of the stuff I said 5 years ago is like totally moronic compared to what I would think now, or at least I perceive it to be. So I would just, explain, or I don't know, compel people to like really follow the recent stuff and stay on top of recent stuff if you're going to be, drafting your own, I don't know, hypothesis about something. Just things evolve over time, and even like the experts in the space are constantly learning and educating themselves.
I couldn't agree more, man. I think it's fun to have that mental freedom and to be seen now as, I think, I'm sure that people who are in the classic carnivore space don't like me anymore. And I'm like, that's great. Like, I don't want to be seen as dogmatic. I'd rather admit like, hey, I'm evolving, I'm learning. Yeah. I was a little wrong on this. And then, I think you eventually then collaborate with people who are also open to that sort of learning. And then you're like, oh, I can trust this guy more, because if he finds something, he's going to say like, hey, I was wrong about this, then maybe you can say like, but I actually think that this thing that I also thought, I still see evidence that is correct. So maybe that stuff is even more valuable. Who knows? But ultimately, it's just about sharing stuff that is valuable to people and helps them improve their quality of life, which is a fun thing to do.